Hello everyone, thank you and welcome back to the channel. This video is going to be on a starter template that I completed. Well, I didn't complete, I got most of it done. And this is going to be a side menu starter template with an authentication flow using Vuex. I'm saving an email and password to local storage to pretend that we have an existing state, existing session saved, so that I can show how to check for the authentication when the user comes back into the application. I also have a side menu. I show how we use Vuex to get the user's email address and show the email address in the side menu. I also show an example of how we use the state information to kind of protect some routes. And then I show how to get access to the information saved in the store in the different pages of the application. And then finally, in the store using Vuex, I show how to use namespaces. In this example, the only namespace I have right now is authentication, but you can imagine that I'd have some other namespace for whatever the data was that I was storing or other pieces of information that I'd want to keep track of. So that's what I'm going to walk through. The other thing I want to make clear is that I've tried my best to comment everything in the application. There's a line of comments pretty much on everything in the application that I don't think is straightforward, so that it gives you guys an opportunity to kind of see what's going on. If you forget or didn't follow the whole video, you can at least read in the code and see what's missing there. So, once again, as it says above me, please make sure to click the subscribe button. It's really, really important. Also, I'm going to make a pitch once again for my book. I'm writing a book on Vue.js. Here's the information for it over here, right up there. There's the information about the book. Please make sure you go to the website, give me some feedback on the pricing, and let's get to the code. Thanks. Okay, thanks and welcome back. So as I mentioned in the intro, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through this Ionic Vue split screen Vuex starter. The key point here is that this is based on the split menu, or what I think it's called side menu template. What I've done is I've gone in, and the important thing to note here in this code is, as I think I stated, I didn't add it here, but what I've done is everything in here is done kind of the old Vue 3 way of doing things. The old Vue 2 way of doing things. There's no setup. Everything's being done using what's called the Options API. I'll leave a link in the bio to talk about the difference between the Composition API and the Options API. But the best way to look at it is that the Options API is how things are done in Vue 2, and the Composition API is what they're pushing in Vue 3 with this whole setup. Please know that you can use, what's interesting is you can kind of use them together. But you can also just use the old way. See how here I have this data.return. Normally what you'd see in the newer solutions is that they use the setup and they use refs to kind of get access to the variables. So everything is done using the old way. In this application, let me see if I can find a fuller example to show you. Yes, so if we look here in the logins page, you'll see, for example, in the login page, there's no setup function, there's no refs. I have my data set up here for the login, which are the credentials, and it has an email and a password. I have a method section here, and I have my method function used as normal. I'm accessing the router using the this. You have access to this now in when you use the methods. So this is I put together this demo or this template this way for folks who are just kind of coming into Vue, trying to get their legs around Vue, trying to get their legs around Ionic, so that they don't have to understand this new setup method and they don't really have to try to do too much TypeScript. I tried to minimize the amount of TypeScript that's utilized in the application also. But let's kind of get started from the beginning, and then we will, from the beginning, go into how Vuex is being utilized. So let's not do it here. Let's do it inside the source code. So if we go to our main TS, let's start at the beginning. We have our normal stuff here. But what we're doing is, before I do anything at all in the app, I need to initialize the application. So basically spin up my backend, check to see if I have an existing user, kind of everything that I want to do before I actually get the app running. And so this store, dispatch, initialize, this function is called. sorry, this method is dispatched inside my store. So that's a good place to start with the store. The other thing that you'll notice here is the store is added to the app and the store is just imported. So since the store is the bulk of this, let's get to the store. I'm not going to do too much talking about what Vuex is. My assumption is that you'll review the links below. VueJS documentation is very clear on it. I'm just going to show you how I've implemented it in this solution. So what I've done here is I've created the store directory. Inside the store, I have the default index. And then one of the other things I did here, I wanted to show the use of modules, or what they also call namespaces. And so to get started with Vue, you create this additional, you create your store, which is what we're doing here, create store. And then because we have modules, I'm naming my module. So this says that I have a module called authentication. As I mentioned in the intro, let's say I had to-dos, right? I might create another module called to-dos. And then inside of this to-dos module, I would import it. And inside of that, I would have my state defined. I would have my state defined. I would have my actions defined. I'd have my mutations defined, and I'd have my getters defined. And so what happens, it allows you to kind of separate the store. So you still have one main store, but you can separate it into namespaces based on these modules that you create. So I've created my authentication module. In my authentication module is where I keep all the information that I want. And you can see my authentication modules imported right here. So if I go to my authentication module, which is here, my authentication model is broken up into separate sections. As I said, I have my state up top. All I'm keeping track of is a user object. And then I'm keeping track of whether or not I did my auth check, which is basically my initialization. Then I have the action section. I always say actions asynchronous, so you always remember all your actions are asynchronous. Then below my actions, I have my mutations. What happens is after you execute an asynchronous action, when you're all done with that action, then you call a mutation, and the mutation commits the changes to the state. So you can see inside of my mutations, this is where the state is being updated. And then the last thing I have is getters, which I kind of look at convenience methods to get access to state. You can do some more interesting things inside of it. I'm just really keeping it simple in this initial one. And what I'm doing is I've just created a simple getter called logged in, which allows you to determine if my user is null or not. If my user is not null, then it means I'm logged in. And then I have a way to actually get the current user. I mean, this is kind of a contrived example because I can define, I can determine if I actually have a logged in user, if I actually have a user, so I can do it with one thing. And then the last thing to notice is down here in the bottom, this namespace. And the namespace is what allows me to kind of separate my different modules out and access them based on their name. And the name is what is defined here inside of the module. So trying to access any of the getters or dispatching any actions, I need to preface it with authentication, which is what you saw here inside of dispatch. So to actually call an action, which is what you start with, you call store dispatch. Since I have a module, I have my module name and then parentheses, the method that I want to dispatch, and I want to dispatch initialize. So that's what's happening. So that's what the store is doing. So let's kind of walk through what happens when I dispatch that. So I call dispatch and I call initialize. So let's go up to the top here and let's get some more room. What we're doing in initialize here, I'm kind of faking that I'm making some sort of API call. So I've kind of, and I want it to be asynchronous, so I've wrapped it in this promise. I've put a little bit of a timeout on it down here. And what we're doing is we are looking in local storage to see if we have a user object. If I have a user object, I get the string of that object. And then what I do is if the string is not null, then I parse it to a JSON object, and that is my user. Otherwise, I set my user to null. And then here's where I commit my auth check, which is how you actually update the store. And I initialize it. I basically say my auth check was true, and I commit my user along with the auth check, which as I'm talking through this, I'm realizing it doesn't really make sense. I don't really need to commit my user here, but that's what I have now, so I will leave it. That's the interesting thing about talking through your code is you kind of learn things and you kind of get better at it. It's almost like peer programming. Because what I do is here, I have I want to commit two separate actions. One is checking if I have a user, and then the next one is basically saving that user. So this is the check. Yes, I checked, and this is where I set the user. So down here, what I do is if I did not get a user back, i.e. so if I got a user, then I take the user, I get the user's email address, and I'm passing it as the payload to a user object that just has an email address. In a more complex application, of course, the user object would have more data, but this is the contrived example. So all I need to do is save the email address to the user object. So I'm saving a user, and inside that user, it has an email, and the email address is a string. If I don't have a user, then I want to just commit null to has user. Now, once you have the context and commit, what that means is it goes down and actions are asynchronous, mutations are not, and mutations are where your commit is. So then it comes down here and it's going to call this has user mutation. I get access to the state, and then my payload is going to be either null or it's going to have a user. The interesting thing is if I use this kind of question mark here or Elvis or whatever they call it nowadays, if I don't have a user, this returns undefined. And since this returns undefined, then it will set my user to null. And so my user state is updated to null. And then down here, when I call my commit on check auth, it takes my payload that's passed in, and my payload has a user object, which is also null, and then it indicates whether or not whether or not I successfully checked authentication, so that state is true. Once that state is set to true, we end up back here at main. This promise is resolved, so then it just fires up the whole application. So that's kind of the first phase of what we're trying to accomplish with Vuex and keeping track of state. The next thing that happens is, so let's kind of walk through. I have the app running here on my phone, I believe, because I'm trying to show how this is capacitor. So I've compiled this application, it's running capacitor. Logging in takes any value for an email. So if I just say aaron@mail.com, password. So now I'm successfully logged in. And then you can see when I go into the menu that it has my email. So I'm using the store to retrieve my email, and I'm also using the store to determine what route I should show. So now let's look at how we're handling the route. Oh, that's an interesting bug from Android. So when I log in, you can see it shows I'm logged in. You can see it has the email address up top here, and that's kind of the behavior that I was looking for. So now let's talk about how the router moves me over to the login page, and just to kind of show you how that works, just quickly, if I log out again, it takes me back to the login page. So it's aware of my state changing. And then just to make sure that we know it's actually working, if I try to access my default route, it doesn't let me in because I'm not logged in, and it redirects me back to the login page, which is the behavior that we want. So now let's look at what's going on inside my router that's allowing all that to happen. So if I open up my router, notice up here at the top that I'm actually importing the store so I can get access to all this information. And we have our routes as we normally have. As I said, I've tried to comment them. So what I'm doing is I'm storing some metadata here. In a later video, I'll show you how I'm using metadata to hide and show the menu. So as you can see, the menu is not visible here. You cannot access it. It's because I'm looking at this metadata value here on my route and determining whether or not I should enable the menu. Let me quickly show you that. Source, views, components, menu. So you can look here on the menu and also see here I'm using the old style with my computed and my methods. Everything's all commented. I return my data so you can get access to it in a template. But I have this computed function computed property called show menu. And what it does is it gets the route. And if the route metadata has the hide menu on it, then you can see up top here, the menu is disabled. And if the menu is disabled, it can't be pulled out. It's not showing here. So that's how I'm hiding the menu on specific pages. I also hide the menu and the detail pages in the application. But let's get back to the router, because that's kind of what I wanted to cover the router in this video, and then we'll cover the UI in the next video. So if we look into my router, we go down to the bottom, and the important part here is this before each. And so as the comment here says, also please notice all the comments, before each route is rendered, execute this function. And so what this function is doing is I'm using my getter that I created. And remember how I was saying you have to use your namespace? Since I've namespaced it, so it says authentication / is logged in. So this gets me the value from my getter for the method called is logged in. And now I have this value. And so what I do is I determine what action I should take if the user is logged in or not. So here, what I'm doing is if the user is logged in and I'm trying to go to the login route, which I clearly don't want to do because I'm already logged in, then as it says here, if logged in and the path is back to login, then redirect the user to the default route. And the default route is that inbox page. So that's that scenario. Once again, I'm getting all this data from my store. The next one is if I'm not logged in and I'm not heading to login already, then take me to the login page. So that happens if someone tries to just put any URL in there. I'm basically going to say, oh, you're not logged in and you're not trying to go to the login route. So I'm going to send you to the login route because that's where you need to go. If none of these conditions are met, then it just does next, which it just moves on and it'll go to whatever route it has assigned to it. And then the last thing I want to show is once again how let's go hop back to the menu, is if I go back to my menu, in my menu here, so I already showed you how we're using data from the route to determine whether or not to hide and show the menu. But if you notice here on the menu, we have the email address, right? And we're getting the email address from the store. And so if you come down here, how am I doing that? Yes, I have another computed property, which uses my getter, which gets the user. So now I have the current user. And as you know, I can use these computed properties the same way I can use, actually there's no data here. I can use this computed property in my template. And so what I'm doing up here in my template is, slow to scroll down. I'm using a current user property and I'm rendering the email address. So let me log in so you can see that. So there's the email address being rendered up there. And then let's show some other places how we're leveraging the store. You can see down here on the logout, I'm dispatching this authentication logout. Authentication logout happens. When it's done happening, I use the router. I replace my current route with the login route, and it takes me back to the login page. To wrap up this video, because we're hitting around the 15-20 minute mark, let's go back to the store, and let's look at authentication and see what logout does. So here, if we go to login, logout, well, that's the commit. Those are the actions. So we go to our actions. You always call your action first, and then you call your commit to update your store. So we go to logout. Once again, I'm faking asynchronous action. All I'm doing here is I'm just clearing my user out. So the order probably should be reversed. So that's how it would work in real life. If I was making like a Firebase logout function, or I was calling my backend, I would call the function to make the logout happen. And then if that happens successfully, then I actually call the commit to update my store. And so I commit clear user. And then using my mutation, clear user, and all it does is it sets my user to null. The important thing here is that I remove the user from local storage. So what will happen is if I refresh the browser or refresh the app, there's no user object. So when I check the authentication, it will say that I'm not logged in. And so that's kind of what you get there. So I think now, honestly, to kind of get to the point here where we're going to just wrap things up for now. I just want to say thanks for checking out the video. I will do a short part 2 where I will cover kind of everything else in the app. I wanted to cover the Vuex stuff first because that might be a little bit newer for a bunch of folks who are checking this out. I'd ask that if you have any thoughts or comments on what you've seen in this video, in preparation for the next video, which I'll probably drop by the end of the week, leave some comments in the project. Be sure to check the links in the description for their project and for signing up for the newsletter. And I appreciate, once again, take care and enjoy the rest of your day.